Cool, let's do it. Just Oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's okay. Yeah, we're sitting. It's all good. Front row? Hey. Oh, nice pants. Very cool. On theme. Cool. So if you're in the back, we're going to get started in a minute. If you don't want to stand the whole time, feel free to come up here, take a seat, see on the floor. There's stools available. There's other corners available. I also want to make sure everybody can see the screen for this. So if you can't, be comfortable. It should be very relaxed though. Like we should be, it should be chill. So if you, get uncomfortable at some point and want to move or something, feel free. And likewise, if you get thirsty and want to grab a drink, go for it. I guess we'll get started. Cool. So, hi everybody. I'm going to do a little bit of preamble just to set things up. So, my name is Benjamin Parry. I'm going to be giving a lecture tonight on Mòzǐ and the posture of progress. If you somehow ended up here and didn't know that that's what was happening, I apologize. Hopefully this is fun for you. There's some snacks and we'll chat afterwards, and I think it's just a beautiful space, so hopefully that works out. My background is I worked for a long time at Tim Hortons. I worked in strategy and operations there. I built their loyalty program and their financial services business. Since then, though, I left that job in February, and since then I've been focused on public education in various guises. I've always been interested in ideas, philosophy, economics, these kinds of things, and in particular over the last 5 years in ideas around progress. What is progress? Where does progress come from? What does it take to produce progress? How do we get more progress? That kind of thing. And I'm currently exploring these ideas as part of the Toronto Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. I'm going to do a little pitch for that at the end, so I'll give you some more details, but that's who I am and why I'm here. I guess one other note before we get started, I want to say thank you to our sponsors and our hosts and Daybreak. So we are currently sitting, if you don't know, in Daybreak Studio. Daybreak is a design and development agency filled with craftspeople who are pursuing kind of beauty and progress as well as any organization I've ever encountered. When I was first talking to Taha about doing a series here, it felt exactly right to me. It felt like there was aligned values, that this was something that worked really well. And so I've been absolutely thrilled to do this here. And it's been awesome. So thank you, Taha. Cool. So this is the last of a 3-part lecture series. They do kind of tie together. So I'm going to go over briefly at the beginning what I talked about in the first lectures, just so that there's some context on this. But they're mostly independent. So to be honest, if you didn't see the first ones, it shouldn't matter at all for this. It's not going to be a big deal. Cool. Anything burning on anybody's chest before we get going? Anybody's got like something they have to say? Okay. I'm going to speak for maybe 40 minutes to maybe as much as 60 minutes. Then we're going to have Q&A for another 40 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. My aim here is to use this lecture as a prompt. It's an idea for us to create an idea space together that we can discuss. I don't have any like esoteric knowledge, or I'm not in like a position to like share something amazing you couldn't find out on the internet here. This is really about creating a space for us to discuss. Okay. So in the first lecture, we talked about progress. Over the last few hundred years, there's been this just incredible progress, economic progress, political progress, social progress. And I think everyone's seen a chart like this at some point, right? There's just this hockey stick of growth, and this is kind of from the economic side. And we asked the question in the first lecture of like, where did this progress come from? What was the reason behind this? Looked at the answers like, oh, it's got something to do with like, there's just coal deposits in a particular place, or like we invented the steam engine or something like that. Found most of those answers unsatisfactory, and argued that, and what I tried to argue is that what really changed was there was a new mentality that people developed. And Anton Howes calls this the improving mentality. It's this kind of posture in relationship to the world that you see the world around you and you see room for improvement, that things could be better, that you could build new technologies, you could write new laws, you could create new social organizations, and that there was this kind of evangelization of this new mentality through different institutions in the 1700s, primarily in Northern Europe, but they're quickly spreading to everywhere in the world. And so we have this improving mentality, and it's what gets us this just incredible progress in every dimension. And it looks kind of roughly something like this. This is a specific example within the improving mentality that the authors of this essay called the calculating paradigm. You have some kind of real-world problem. You measure that problem, produce some mathematical representation of that. You could just call it a categorization in general. You manipulate that representation to produce some solution, and then you apply that solution back into the real world. And this kind of loop, this being a specific mathematical one, but this kind of loop in general, where we saw the world, saw a way to improve it through some kind of categorization, and then an application based off of that categorization, is what we've been doing in kind of a large scale over the last few hundred years. And that was the first lecture. Actually, there was one more thing. At the end of the first lecture, what I pointed to and got to in the second lecture was that this growth, though, that was produced by the improving mentality, we have a question, which is that improving mentality going to keep taking us forward into the future of progress? Are we going to be able to use this mentality forever to just get better and better and better on every dimension? And if you look at the US or these areas where progress has been really have been at the forefront of progress over this time period, unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's quite working like it used to. This is a graph of total factor productivity. I'm not an econometrician, but roughly you can think of this as the amount of stuff created per person in an economy, something like that. The black line shows a hypothetical 2% trend. And in the beginning of the kind of 20th century, that was the trend line that we were on in the US. We were just producing more and more. 2% every year gets very large gains very, very quickly. But then at some time in the 1970s, we fell off of this line, and we started to stagnate. And we just stopped producing things like we used to. It's not that we've stopped progressing altogether, but we're not progressing anywhere near the rate that we used to. And there's a lot of other metrics that look like this. Life expectancy looks like this. It used to be increasing at a very, very rapid rate, but it's leveled off pretty aggressively. In the US, it's actually gone backwards in recent years. There's also something to do with kind of scientific productivity, that maybe science is as productive as it used to be and at a top line level, but the number of scientists per productivity means that we're not doing science at any way like the rate that we used to, even if science overall is still progressing at something like a rate, right? Because we used to, let's say, get one good scientific idea for every 10 people. Now we're getting one good scientific idea for every 100 people. We have 10x the number of people in science, so overall we're getting as many good scientific ideas, but the rates just aren't looking like they used to. And so something has happened to go wrong here. And there's a lot of potential reasons for this. I'm not going to be able to enumerate all of them, but in the second lecture, I tried to explain one potential reason for why this is, why the improving mentality isn't working for us quite like it used to. And the argument that I made is that when we make these categories, when we produce this categorization of the world, we engage in a process of setting ourselves up for Procrustean beds. We create our categorization, but there are rough edges. There are things that don't quite fit inside of the categorization. There are things that we need to stretch and pull to fit within it. And it creates these rough edges that if we don't solve for them, we can kind of get stuck inside of that categorization. So this is an example of what that looks like. This is the plan voisin. It was a plan by Le Corbusier, who was a very famous modernist architect, to fix Paris. It was very popular at the time. People thought this was actually like a really good idea. And what he was going to do is he was going to create these like clean residential areas and work areas, and he was going to put everything neatly into these categorizations so that it would be possible for people to move around within the city with no problems. He'd get rid of all the dirt. He'd make it much more efficient to move electricity and water around and these kinds of things. It didn't happen, thank God. We've noticed that this isn't what Paris looks like. This is just a plan. But it's clear just from looking at this, obviously he missed something in his categorization, right? There was some way about the way that he was solving the problem of Paris, because it really would have been more efficient, right? Like it really would have improved efficiency and made people's lives easier on all the dimensions that he wanted. But there's clearly something that he's missing here, right? And so that's what I tried to argue is that is what's happened on every front with the improving mentality. We've taken all of the world, we've carved it up into these categories, and we've set ourselves up all of these ways that those categories break down at the edges. And I then argued that breakdown at the edges starts to impact our ability to do the thing we actually wanted originally in the first place. That the thing we wanted originally in the first place relied on the world to be set up in some way that we didn't fully understand and wasn't captured perfectly in our original categorization. And this is an example, I think, of where that's happening. These are PISA scores, which, as far as I can tell, are one of the most rigorous measures of academic achievement in the world. They are, every 3 years, there are these standardized tests that are done in every OECD country. So it excludes some of the most important countries like Brazil and China, but it's a good set. It's like 38 countries and captures most of what we think of as like, quote unquote, the developed world. And so every 3 years, they do every country and they test reading, mathematics, science. And this is not a good trend. This is the average educational attainment across all 38 countries. And this is not a good trend line for us. We are spending more per student. We're putting more hours into schooling. We are creating much more rigorous educational infrastructure in basically every single one of the countries measured. And the actual educational attainment is not going in the right direction. And this breaks down a little bit by country, so some countries it's a little bit different, but this is pretty much true across the board. This is true in even the best. This is true in Singapore, Taiwan, Canada, which are like the best countries in the world at educating. It's still this kind of trend line. And so I argued that, okay, so we need to find some way to move past the categorizations that we've been creating, the way that we've engaged with the world as a result of the improving mentality. We need some change in our posture that allows us to continue to improve, that allows us to get past the issues that are inherent in the improving mentality. And so that brings us to the lecture today. So what I can promise you with this lecture is I'm going to talk about this ancient Chinese philosopher, Mòzǐ, and I'm going to give you a little bit of history about ancient China and about ancient Chinese philosophy. And so if you've never heard that before, hopefully that's kind of fun, that you just know a little bit more about the history of the world. And so that I can promise you that you'll get something fun out of that. And then I'm going to present 3 of Mòzǐ's ideas that I think have the potential to help us move past the problems that we're facing with progress today. That will offer us new postures. I don't think any of these is the answer. There's no clean, logical, perfect thing here. But I think that each of these ideas is very practical, that you can take these, you can apply it to your own posture in your work, in your own life. You can apply it to your organizations, and you can maybe even apply it to our society. And it can very practically help us to progress. And so I'm going to try and do that, and hopefully at least one of them resonates. So a little bit about Chinese history. So Chinese history is generally understood as a succession of dynasties. So you have these different dynasties that have different characteristics associated with them, and that's generally how you map out the kind of full Chinese history. The first dynasties, the Xia dynasty and the Shang dynasty, these are somewhat kind of mythical proto-periods. We don't really have much from this period that talks about the specifics of these states. They mostly show up in later texts where people are talking about these as kind of these amazing mythical places from the past. Very similar to how you might imagine how in the Jewish tradition, like Abraham is talked about. It's like we don't have any evidence for Abraham apart from the tradition, but the tradition has like a very clear story about him. And so that's the Xiang Shang. And we do have, for example, things like this. So this is a wine vessel of some kind. Maybe it's ritual. You have no idea for these kinds of things. People say it's like a ritual wine vessel, but it's a thing we dug out of the ground. We have no idea what it is. And it's from Ali To. I don't know what the tones are for that. An area, it's the oldest kind of bronze finds in China, and it's from 1600 BCE. So we know something was happening, right? Because like this is complicated. Like this is a very complex object. It requires a really sophisticated economy. It requires a really sophisticated kind of artistry to produce something like this. Like what's the social dynamics that it fits within? It's like quite a lot. So we know something was happening, but we don't really know we don't really know much beyond that. Then you get the Zhou dynasty, and the Zhou dynasty is clearly real, and it's a centralized, kind of powerful bureaucratic state of some kind. I'm not quite sure, but I think it's like roughly around here in like the center of this map. And the Zhou dynasty, things are pretty prosperous. You have a set of good kings. The society becomes relatively wealthy. Things go pretty well. But then eventually, like all things, it eventually collapses. And this leads into what's known as the Warring States period. And this is what you can see in the chart or the map on the far right. And the Warring States period is not good. It is conflict and famine and pestilence. It is this kind of constant rivalry between all of these different factions. This originally was a GIF. I couldn't get it to play, my bad. What it shows is like every 5 years, this map is changing constantly, and there's a lot of people dying, and it's very bad in a bunch of different ways. Eventually, it ends when the Qin dynasty, which is this kind of little red one here, just swallows everything, and it does it in a very bloody and horrific manner. That's what comes next, and that's what we think of as the first real Chinese state. It's actually where China, the word comes from, is Qin. It's actually like where it comes from. And that's the state that has kind of like real centralized bureaucracy in the way that we think of today, and is the kind of proto-state for everything else. But it doesn't last very long for all the reasons that it's kind of like led by like a bloody tyrannical ruler kind of thing. Collapses into the Han dynasty, and then from there it just continues in kind of other dynasties like that, not important to our story. For our story, the important period is the Warring States period, because even though it was, or perhaps because it was such a time of conflict and famine and death and destruction, it was an incredibly dynamic moment for philosophy and an incredibly dynamic moment for ideas about the world. And in particular, this period is called, or this kind of like philosophical production in this period is called the 诸子百家, which is the 100 schools of thought. And you can think of this as similar perhaps to Greece and kind of like in that period of great philosophical production, that we think of it as kind of being Plato and Aristotle, and that's the tradition. But there's dozens of philosophers with different competing schools who are all trying to work out the meaning of the universe, and all of it kind of ends up in Plato and Aristotle, but it also filters out into the broader philosophical currents that form the entire kind of Western philosophical edifice. This is similar. We think about Confucius and his tradition as being like the tradition that comes out of this, but it's really that this is this flowering of ideas that forms the backdrop for the whole Chinese philosophical project. So you have these different groups. Each of them is called a jia, which is like, it's family in common parlance, but it's like a school in kind of this context. The first one is the Rujia. Fun fact: this is what we think of as Confucianism. This is the sinologists, so like the Chinese scholars, are fighting a very, very losing battle to try and rename this Ruism. The reason is that Ru is this, it's kind of means scholar, like scholar official. And really, this is the philosophical tradition of like the scholar officials. They're never going to win that battle. It's Confucianism. The next one is Fajia, legalism. This is the Fajia kind of believe that the way to govern the state, the way to produce a great society, is you create the perfect set of laws, the perfect set of rules, and then you just enforce them in a bloody manner. And that's actually what happened with the Qin dynasty, was they were legalists. They were like, okay, we've got all the right rules, boom, we got this now. maybe there's something to it, but it didn't work out that long. Then you have Daojia. The Taoists are, this is much more like a religious group than it is a philosophical group. It's deeply profound about the nature of human existence and so forth. And if you haven't heard of it, the Tao Te Ching, which is the kind of initial text of Taoism, is maybe not the initial text, but it's a very important text in Taoism, is this an incredible book. I highly recommend reading it. It's like a transformative work. The militarists, so this is the Bingjia. This is like Sun Tzu and all of that kind of like war-winning stuff. They basically are like, well, we're fighting the wars, better win the wars. That's like that's the kind of philosophy there. And then you have many, many others, but you also have Mòzǐ, which is the Mohists. And their primary work, their master is called Mòzǐ, and their primary book is called the Mòzǐ. Or like the kind of like the primary text of Master Mo. And so I'm going to speak, I'm not going to be able to watch my language perfectly. I'm going to speak throughout this of like the Mòzǐ, like what Mòzǐ thinks, like that kind of thing. It's the text. It's like this tradition where these ideas come from. We don't know exactly who said what and when. Of these, though, I think people have a good sense of Confucianism, Taoism, maybe of like Sun Tzu, maybe they even have some sense of what the legalists might be like. But Mòzǐ is basically unknown for the most part in like most Western contexts. I think in China that started to change, but for a very long time, after the Han Dynasty, Mòzǐ really fell out of fashion as this kind of important part of the philosophical tradition. I think that is a huge shame for multiple reasons. One, it's a huge shame because, as I'm hopefully going to talk about, it's an incredibly profound and valuable philosophy, but also because I actually think that the philosophical ideas of Mòzǐ have been essential to the philosophy in China. For example, one of the things that Mòzǐ is hyper-focused on is meritocracy, and this idea that you have to make sure that the best people get the best jobs and are in the kind of hyper-meritocratic structure. And so it's not obvious that things like the imperial examination system, which was this kind of incredible invention in China that allowed for genuine meritocracy like thousands of years before any other country, would have existed without Mòzǐ. So there's kind of like it's important, I think, to remember him. So who is Mòzǐ? So this is from a film which the English title they give it is A Battle of Wits, which is like fine, but the Chinese title is like Mòzǐ Attacks, which is like way better. But like nobody knows who Mòzǐ is, so like I don't know. Anyway, it's a fun film. It's fun. Mòzǐ is really interesting. At this time, so like in this period where you have all these different schools, the way that it's operating is, in Greece you have like schools where you have this philosopher who teaches at the school, students come to the school, they become part of the philosopher's, like, retinue is the wrong word, but something like that. What's happening here is a little bit different, that each of these philosophers, what they're doing is they're going to each of the warring states. There are these like dozens of warring states, and they're going to the kings and the lords there, and they're like selling their philosophical wares. They're like, oh, I've got the ideas. Like, I've got the ideas that are going to make you the great king. King, you should hire me in some sense. And so they all have their reasons to like, so they're kind of like, instead of arguing over ideas in like the Greek sense, they're kind of arguing over like what makes for a great state. And Mòzǐ, what he's famous for is that he probably started life as a carpenter or an artisan, something like this. He had some kind of, like, he worked with his hands. He has a lot of analogies throughout all of his work about, like, making your ideas straight in the way that, like, a carpenter uses a tool to, like, make an object straight, something like that. And when he had this gimmick, it's not really a gimmick, but he had this thing that when he went around to sell his philosophical ideas to the kings, he would also sell actual tooling to win battles and tooling to make their societies better. So he would sell like siege weapons, and he'd be like, okay, you can have my philosophy, but also how about a siege weapon as like, part of it, something like that. And so that's kind of what's depicted in this film, and that's kind of the story of him. And actually, he really was an inventor. Like in the Mòzǐ, part of it is a bunch of description of different tools, and one of the tools that it describes is the first description in world history of a camera obscura. And so a camera obscura is this thing where you have a pinhole, light shines through it, and you get like an image shine on the other side. It's kind of like a proto-camera. It's like camera obscura. And it's the first ever description of that. And there's actually a number of other inventions that are at least written down in the Mòzǐ that seem like one of the first examples of them globally. So he's a really interesting character. So what is his thought like? What is his philosophy like? Most of this comes from this book by this guy, Chris Fraser. He was a professor at U of T. He's now at the University of Hong Kong. I think it's a fantastic book. He seems to be doing an amazing job of rehabilitating the importance of Mòzǐ in the kind of Western world. Suddenly he got me, he convinced me. And now I'm trying to do it too. So most of this comes from this. And what Chris Fraser argues is that Mòzǐ he was incredibly practical. Like in all of his work, he's always analogizing to using some kind of tool to like make your ideas better. He's always thinking about things in terms of skills and practice and producing like the best possible outcome. And Chris Fraser argues that he's actually the first ever consequentialist. So he's the first person to look at the world and say, from an ethical perspective, what matters is the outcome. What matters isn't that like, somebody did a good action. What matters isn't that somebody was like acting in the way that heaven wanted them to act, though he would argue that like that's good that they act in the way that heaven wants them to act, because that's probably going to have a good outcome, but that it's the outcome that matters. And then he based everything off of that. His ethics is based off of that. His epistemology is based off of that, there's this kind of like skillfulness in being able to understand the world, and it's this like hyper-practical philosophy. And this kind of approach to thinking about the world doesn't exist in Europe until the improving mentality. It exists at the same time as the improving mentality first kind of gets into fashion, around with like Bentham and John Stuart Mill and the first utilitarians. And the first utilitarians' approach to this kind of philosophy, this sense that like, what's good is based on outcomes, was to say that there's some kind of unit of like individual happiness called utils, and the aim is to like maximize the number of utils, and then you just produce a system that maximizes the number of utils. Actually, compared to Mòzǐ, very weak. Like there's all kinds of holes in this. It's like, okay, well, like, is it really like just one single type of happiness that they're all the same as? How do you compare, like, if one person gets 10 happinesses versus another person who gets 1, versus one gets 6 and the other gets 3? The overall happiness is like, there's all these ways that it just doesn't make any sense from actually understanding how ethics works. But then on top of that, it's totally impractical. You can't use this, right? Like in the real world. Anyway, I have problems with utilitarians, my bad. And so utilitarians are the first ones to be consequentialists. And I think that Mòzǐ's work is a lot more like the American pragmatist. Like when I read Mòzǐ, it's very modern. It feels like he's talking to me in the way that like modern people think about ethics and think about knowledge in this very pragmatic American pragmatist style. And the second picture here, the first picture here is John Stuart Mill. The second picture here is William James. I mean, look at this guy. Like this is like American freewheeling. He's just having fun. It's amazing. He didn't actually have a lot of fun in his life, but I think this picture is just amazing. And in the pragmatist view, there's this idea of knowledge, that knowledge has a cash value, that knowledge is something that actually gives you some way of operating in the real world. And that's what I see when I read the Mòzǐ, is this sense that like, what you know, your ethics, your actions, it all is all based on skills that you're actually making use of in the real world. Okay, so that's the background on Chinese history and Mòzǐ. Okay, my bad. I'm sorry. Terrible timing. Okay. Okay. Okay, so that's the background. Hopefully, if you didn't know about Chinese history, I gave you some ideas. But I now want to talk about Mòzǐ's ideas. And Mòzǐ had a lot of different ideas, and they all kind of fit together in different ways. But I want to highlight 3 that I think are really transformative potentially. And these are universal care, promote the worthy, and reject fatalism. Okay, so universal care, 兼爱. And I'm going to read this. I think it's the best way for us to, it's a lot, but I think it's the best way for us to get a sense of like how Mòzǐ's thought works and also to ground the concept. And And I've kind of edited this for clarity and brevity, but I've kept 90% of it the same. But just to be clear, it's not a direct quote. Okay. What are the world's benefits? What are the world's harms? States attacking one another, households usurping one another, people injuring one another, rulers and ministers not being respectively kind and loyal, fathers and sons not being respectively loving and filial. These are the world's harms. How can we examine what these harms arise from? They arise through lack of inclusive care or universal care. Nowadays, feudal lords only know to love their own states, but not to love the states of others. They have no qualms about mobilizing their own state to attack another state. Nowadays, individual people only know to love their own persons and not to love the persons of others. They have no qualms about promoting their own persons and injuring the persons of others. When the people of the world don't all love one another, then the strong inevitably dominate the weak. The many inevitably plunder the few. The rich inevitably ridicule the poor. The noble inevitably scorn the lowly, and the cunning inevitably deceive the foolish. Within the world, in all cases, the reason why calamity, usurpation, resentment, and hatred arise is because mutual love does not exist. Okay, so what's he getting at? Firstly, very practically, he's talking about wars, right? He's talking about these different states attacking one another. This is a zoomed-in version of the chart that I showed right at the beginning, showing this kind of crazy economic progress that we've experienced. And it's basically just a clean exponential, right? We're just going up and to the right. But there's two weird things here. The first is, a couple years ago, we had a 1-year blip in our curve. Right? I don't know why we did that, but we did. You know, there was like a disease involved. Not going to get into it. We all know the story. And so we had this kind of momentary blip, but we're right back on the curve. You know, we got straight back out on the horse. But then there's another blip, and these are a decade apart. These dots. So it was between 1940 and 1950, and we were poorer globally in 1950 than we were in 1940. And the reason for this was World War II. Because wars destroy infrastructure, they kill people, they cause famines, they cause pestilence like nothing else. And if we want to actually progress, the worst thing we could be doing from actually creating the foundations that allow us to do that progress is fighting wars with one another. And it's totally self-imposed. And so that's the first thing he's getting at, is that these wars thing, which he's very familiar with, right? He's going around selling siege weapons. Not such a great idea. All right. The second thing, though, that's kind of at a macro level. At a micro level, antagonism and fighting actually prevents us from getting as much stuff. So this is a graphic from an amazing blog post by this guy, Alex Danko. If you're in tech in Toronto, you should read Alex Danko's blog. And it's called Why the Canadian Tech Sector Doesn't Work. And what he's doing is he's trying to compare how the tech sector in Toronto works compared to SF. And in Toronto, what he says is, okay, well, you have a certain number of startups, maybe a pretty small number of startups, and they want to then go and raise capital. They want to go make a bigger startup, get some money in. So they go to the investors. But what happens is they go to the investors, and the investors I don't know, is this a good startup or not? I don't know if I trust you. Let me go read through all of your documents. Let me do all my due diligence. Let me ask you a bunch of questions. Okay. I've finally figured it out. A month later, I'm going to invest in you. Here's $10,000. But you have to sign this agreement where I get a very nice chunk of your company, and I need these investor updates every month, and it's gonna be tough. Okay, if I take the money, finally I can start my startup. And what he says is, okay, well, you have this problem here where because the investors think that there's a limited pie and they need to invest their money very precisely into the right startups, they're going to make sure that they get exactly the right deals, and it kind of shrinks the overall potential for startups, because in that month I probably went bust and died, right? My company isn't viable anymore. And then similarly, that leads to this finite mindset amongst the startups, where I'm okay, well now there's only so many investors, only giving out so much money. I don't really want any other startups here. I don't want any other startups talking to these investors. I'm not going to put a name in here because that would be That would be a bad thing to do. But like some investor is my friend. I'm not going to let anybody else go to that investor, or like I'm not going to recommend any other stuff. So you have this kind of like finite thing where you have this finite amount of resources, finite number of startups, and you're just fighting over the like singular pie. Versus he says in SF, I'm a startup founder. I've got this great new idea. I reach out to my investor friend, and I made friends with them because another startup founder was like, "Oh, you should go talk to this guy because like everybody just wants to help everybody." I go and I grab coffee with this investor, and by the end of the meeting with the investor, he's like, "Here's a $20,000 check. You can figure out the terms later." Because there's this sense in SF that there's going to be so many startups that are going to be successful, that people want to be in every single one of them, that if that startup is then successful, it's going to produce a boatload of cash, there's going to be even more investors, and it's just going to keep growing this pie overall. And you're not fighting over specific scraps, you're just engaged in this overall productive ecosystem. And this is another kind of universal care. It's a sense of looking at the startup or looking at the investor and believing that they are kind of like on your side and trying to win and that it's good for everybody. And so that's kind of more micro case. But then when I think of universal care, for me, the most important aspect of it isn't in fact either the wars that destroys infrastructure or the positive sum interactions that produce like richer ecosystems because everybody's like believes that their ecosystem is going to get richer. It's humility. So this is a painting of the Good Samaritan. So the story of the Good Samaritan is Jesus is being tested. One of the guys is like, "Well, who's my neighbor?" Jesus has just said, "You got to love your neighbor." And he's like, "Well, who's my neighbor, Jesus?" And Jesus is like, "Okay, well, look. So you've got this road that the people are walking down, and there's a guy on the road, and he's attacked by robbers. He's beaten. He's left at the side of the road for dead. And a priest walks by and sees this person, and they walk on by. It's kind of taboo for priests to touch dead bodies because they're unclean. And the priest is like, "That's not my deal. I don't know this guy. That's not my deal." Then a Levite walks by. A Levite is another kind of sect of these kind of like very religious proper groups. Very similar, he just walks by. Then a Samaritan walks by. And a Samaritan, it's very important to this story, is hated by the Jews. The Samaritans and the Jews hate each other. And so when Jesus is telling this story, you're imagining my worst enemy, who I think is just awful in every way, comes by. And the Samaritan comes over, and he helps this guy up, and he takes him to the nearest inn, and he gets him fed, he gets him watered, and he gives him money so that he can pay the innkeeper, and then he's going to come back to him later. And Jesus says, "Okay, which of these was like a neighbor?" It was the Samaritan, right? The Samaritan was the person who was like a neighbor. And what I take from that is you need to be humble about where your support is going to come from. You need to be humble about like where what's good in this world lives, where what's good in this world is possible to be from. And that it's this kind of universal care, this attitude of looking at all of your neighbors, looking at all of the people in the world, looking at all the things in the world, and genuinely believing that they have worth, that allows you to have that humility, that allows you to look at it with fresh eyes and say, wow, this could actually help solve my problem. Wow, this thing is actually valuable to me in some fashion. So one more anecdote from this this is Sun Yat-sen. Out of interest, who knows who Sun Yat-sen is? I'm just really fascinated. Okay, cool. That's interesting that you guys clustered. Well, do you all know each other? You don't know that. Okay, cool. So Sun Yat-sen is fascinating. Another everyone should know Sun Yat-sen. So there are actually two statues of Sun Yat-sen in Toronto. One of them is in Chinatown. When you're walking up Savannah, it's on the left next to the Civic Center, and then the other one is at the south end of Riverdale Park next to East Chinatown. And so Sun Yat-sen is thought of as kind of the initial revolutionary in China. He wasn't actually literally spearheading the final revolution that kind of produced the modern modern China, but he had essential revolutionary activity. And one of the fascinating things about Sun Yat-sen is that he is revered by both Taiwan and mainland China. That in both cases he's seen as this essential person for the creation of the modern Chinese state. In either case. And Sun Yat-sen was this like very global, well-traveled, well-read person. He was influential in kind of democratic and republican movements throughout all of East and Southeast Asia, and generally like a very impressive, really amazing guy. And he had this idea of Bo-ai. And Bo-ai, very similar in some sense to Jian-ai, that it's about this kind of universal care fraternity. And he believed that you had to have this kind of posture amongst the citizenry before you could have democracy, before you could have republicanism, and that it was essential to producing the modern states that he dreamed of to produce this amongst the citizenry. And I think this is an example of how like Mòzí's ideas kind of filter through in the Chinese philosophical tradition and are actually continue to be important, even if he's actually been, I don't know if forgotten's the right word, but set aside compared to these other teachers. Cool. So that's the first idea, universal care. Second idea, promote the worthy. And this is shangxian. At the present time, kings all wish their state to be rich, with a large population and a well-ordered administration. Nevertheless, they fail to get what they desire. What is the reason for this? It is because kings are unable to use promoting the worthy. If a state has many officers who are worthy and good, its order will be substantial, whereas if officers who are worthy and good are few, its order will be slight. So, responsibility properly lies in increasing the number of worthy men and nothing more. Suppose you wish to increase the number of those skilled in archery. You must enrich them, ennoble them, respect them, and praise them. Then archers can be obtained in large numbers. How much more so does this apply to officers who are worthy and good, men whose virtue is substantial? Such men are certainly treasures of the state. But it is also necessary to enrich them, ennoble them, respect them, and praise them. Then good officers can be obtained in large numbers. These officers, this is in relation to these officers, if his rank and position are not high, the people will not respect him. If his stipend is not generous, the people will not trust him. If his administration and decrees are not put into effect, the people will not fear him. Okay. So what's he getting at? So for this, I want to talk about Singapore. So excited I finally get to talk about Singapore. Okay, so over the last few years, everyone's been really focused on the fact that America's had great economic growth, right? Like American economic growth is really fantastic. I don't know, I assume a lot of people have seen this chart where like Canada and America are diverging pretty aggressively. And it's really America in like all of the G7 at this point. That they have this amazing moment economically. Well, let me tell you about Singapore. Okay, so this is kind of since Singapore's founding over the last 70 years. You've had US, Canada, Japan. Even Japan came from a low point as well. They've all had great economic growth, and Singapore's just up and to the right. Singapore doesn't care. You want to talk about constraints of like physical products. You want to talk about constraints on like human capital. You want to talk about constraints on technology. Singapore doesn't care. They're having economic growth. They're having better life expectancy. It's amazing on every dimension. And there's lots of potential reasons for this. But what it really seems like is essentially that Singapore just keeps taking great decisions. Like every single decision that this country takes seems to be like perfect. And there's lots of things about like they've invested in their military in a really smart way. They've built really great schools. They're at the top of that PISA ranking that I was talking about. They've invested in really smart transit systems, like all of these things. And those are kind of like high-level statecraft type things. But then there's also all these decisions that like you wouldn't even think at first that it would be important, but have been very important. So, for example, one of the first things that happened in Singapore was they installed a bunch of AC. So Singapore is extremely hot. It's like right on the equator. It's really oppressive if you're kind of walking around in the heat of the day, and that's like all year round. There aren't really seasons. And so they said, okay, well, we want all of our government workers to be really effective at their jobs, so we're going to install AC. At the time, people are like, oh, that's kind of weird. I don't know if that's like that important for this, but it turns out it's very important. And actually, there's been a lot of empirical work done on this that as the outside temperature rises, people's IQ goes down, like very dramatically. So like if you're ever like trying to solve a really hard problem and your room is hot, that's like the first thing you should do is try to decrease the temperature in there. It actually uses up a lot of resources, it's very distracting, it's really hard. So they installed a lot of AC, really important. Another example, Singapore realized that the airport in Singapore is extremely important, that people fly in and out of the airport. So they fly in, and when they leave the airport, that's their first impression of the country. It's kind of like if you have an app and it's your kind of like onboarding flow. Tells people what to expect. It tells them about the infrastructure. It tells them about like the nature of the country. And so they said, we're going to have the best airport in the world. We're going to have people fly in and think that this is amazing, and we're going to have great transit into the rest of the city. And if you've ever been to Singapore, they succeeded. It's amazing. Like Changi Airport is so efficient. It's so beautiful. This actually is in the airport. Like it actually looks like that. It's actually in the airport. You can hang out there while you're like waiting for your bags or something. It's this kind of crazy experience. And so that's an interesting decision. But then, those are kind of like gimmicky in some sense, right? That kind of like sounds good. But here's a crazy decision. So I did Raffles Hospital, which is one of the kind of main hospitals. Singapore has amazing life expectancy. The US life expectancy started to go down recently. Theirs is not. Theirs is still going up. And it's mostly because they have just an incredible healthcare system. And what the government realized was, healthcare, that's actually just like anything else. We want to get more money into our healthcare. So what we want foreign direct investment. So why don't we become the central hub for people in East and Southeast Asia for medical tourism? And so they created these hospitals. They started to advertise, fly to Singapore to go use our healthcare. They created a specific visa, which is a medical visit visa, which is easier to get. So you can just go in, get medicine, and walk out. If you're in, as a result, they have this massive foreign direct investment into their healthcare system. If you're in Canada or the UK, for that matter, that's like blowing your mind. The idea that you're like inviting people to come use your healthcare, right? Like that's like the last thing you could imagine. It's like, wow, like that seems so insane. But they understood how this system worked, and they actually realized this was a way to get foreign direct investment. And there's just all of these decisions like this. So what's happening? So I've heard arguments for this that like, it's because like Singaporeans are really smart and they have like great IQ or something. I've heard arguments that it's because they are despotic and it's like a single party system and that like allows you to do more effective policy things or something like that. And maybe there's like something to that. Like I think Singaporeans are very smart. I do think that their system is very like orderly and structured, and that allows them to do things very effectively. But like there are lots of countries like that. There are lots of really smart countries. There are lots of like more less democratic countries. So I'm not quite convinced. So what is it about Singapore though that is completely different to anywhere else? That's actually like at a whole different order of magnitude to anywhere else. They pay everyone in the government really well. Really, really well. And I have a friend in Singapore, he's called John, and he's a startup founder. Successful guy, he's raised for his startup, it's growing really fast. It's B2B SaaS, but it's something, it's growing, John's great. John's fantastic, but I was talking to John about his path, and he was telling me, when I was in high school, what I really wanted more than anything was I wanted to lead the urban planning department. You can imagine in Singapore, it's a single city-state. Urban planning is like a big deal when you're in a state like that. And he's like, that's all I wanted was lead the urban planning department. So he worked crazy hard. He got really good grades. He was inventive in his kind of career as a high school student. He had all these extracurriculars. He went to debates. He got into NUS, best university in Singapore, like fourth best university on the face of the planet. He again got amazing grades. He again led all of these extracurricular things. He got a first internship at the urban planning department. He started working at the urban planning department, and he worked really hard. And he kind of got to the end of the internship, and his boss came to me and he said, "Look, John, you're amazing. You work really hard. You're really smart. You're great. You're just not quite at the quality we need. You're not going to cut it here." And he was devastated. He left this and he was like, "Oh gosh, this is all I wanted in my entire life was to go do this." And then he kind of picked himself back up, started a company, and now he's a successful entrepreneur. So he's fine. But this story, this sense that the best thing you could do is go work for the government because you can make more money than doing anything else. You're going to be respected. You're going to be able to take decisions that meaningfully impact people's lives for the better because you're not stuck in some bureaucratic machine. Like, that was his experience, and that's the experience of his peers. And I think that's this unique thing that Singapore has figured out, is they have put the best people in the country, the people who would go become founders, the people who would go become consultants, the people who would go become top financiers in statecraft. And that's what they do, is they build an amazing state together. So that's one side of it. It's just like, get your best decision makers, your best like talent, and put them in the best place by like paying them a lot. But then there's another aspect of promoting the worthy. And so this is about glory. So I hope at this point everybody knows that we have a fertility problem, and this is like the biggest problem. Like you know, we don't feel it yet, but you know, in basically every developed country, we're below replacement. And going there much faster, right? Like fertility is dropping at a much faster rate than anybody expects. Like even in the states which are still above replacement, like Nigeria, every year the fertility numbers come in way below what we expected. And so this is a problem that's developing very fast. And in some places, like in South Korea, you know, you're getting to the point where it's, I can't remember exactly, but it's at like 0.7, 0.8, I think, in South Korea now. That means that every 20 years, your generation is a third of the size before. So the country, like it's unbelievable how kind of like fast this will develop as it gets going, kind of 40 years from now or so. It's a real big problem. But here's two examples of how we have actually done something about this. How this isn't some kind of global thing. It seems that like actually fertility can change in some ways. So this is the first example. It's about TSMC employees. So this data isn't from this year. I can't remember exactly when this is, but like roughly the fertility rate in Taiwan is about 1.24, way below replacement, which is 2.1. But TSMC employees are above replacement rate. In fact, TSMC, which is the largest semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan, though TSMC employees make up 0.3% of Taiwan's population, they are responsible for 1.8% of all babies born in Taiwan. Of every 50 Taiwanese babies born, one is a TSMC baby. It's crazy. And so why is this? Well, the reason is that we know this because the company put out a press release talking about how proud they were about this. And a core part of the company culture is promoting families, promoting having kids. And in exactly the same way that at Google they give you like really nice cafeterias and rooms where you can go play video games and whatever, TSMC produces the best schools in the country, are on their campuses. And so you can bring your kids to work, they get the best education in the country, and that's what they've invested all of their excess cash in, is this, well, not all of it, but a lot of it is this kind of promotion of a pronatal environment. And the executives are like this. The executives put out this press release. You know, they're like proud of this. They think that this is a great culture to produce. And so they've created glory in having kids. They've made it something that we honor, that our society actually believes in. And you know, there are lots of countries that put a lot of money into this now. Hungary, I think, is spending 5% of its GDP on this each year, is trying to like get people to have more kids. So a lot of countries, like this country, are trying to like put money behind this problem. It never works. But it seems that if you actually glorify it, you make it culturally positive, you can do something. And so the other example of this is Mongolia. So Mongolia doesn't do any economic, tomfoolery to this. They don't really have much money to move around. But if you look at them compared to comparable countries in Central Asia, in different kind of, you can see these are the different provinces in China and also kind of related areas, they have this stubbornly high fertility rate. And actually, in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been increasing. It's actually been going up recently. And the reason is, if you have 4 kids in Mongolia, you receive the Order of Maternal Glory. And you go to the presidential palace, and the president shakes your hand, and there's this big ceremony, and there's this giant statue of Genghis Khan behind you, and it's sick. And then it's really cool. And also, like, everyone's dressed up to the nines. It's amazing. And then if you have 6 kids, you have an even bigger party. And so it's been promoted as it's what the culture believes in. The culture believes in having kids. It's what they care about. They think that's a good thing. And so they've promoted the people who do the thing that they believe is a good value to highly in the social hierarchy. So this is the other thing with promoting the worthy. It's not just about putting the people who are the best at making decisions in the best place to take decisions. It's about putting the people that we want to model ourselves after in the position where we can model ourselves after them. Okay. So you could say with all of these examples that that's fine. You can promote the worthy when you have like a non-democratic structure. You know, you have like a company where you just put somebody at the top that's like the best, or you have a country where the country gets to decide by fiat what happens. But democracy doesn't really work like that. There's a lowest common denominator thing in democracy where we're going to elect kind of the worst people, and then the worst people are going to elect the worst people, and it's just going to be like awful all the way down. And I think that maybe there's some truth in that, but I don't think so. I actually think that our system, a democratic system, allows us to have more powerful ability to promote the worthy, a more important way to promote the worthy, and this kind of self-reinforcing feedback loop that can truly allow us to use this posture to transform our societies for the better in a way that I don't think non-democratic systems can. So this is Bobby Kennedy, not the current guy, Bobby Kennedy. Just out of interest, this was not part of my education at all. I grew up in the UK. Who here knows about Bobby Kennedy in like they feel like they could tell the story of Bobby Kennedy to some degree? All right, that's so interesting, so interesting. Okay, so this is Bobby Kennedy. So not as famous as his brother, JFK, but I actually think a more stunning human being. So Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General during the Civil Rights Movement. So if you think about the Civil Rights Movement, you have all of these moments. You have people doing the freedom rides. You have people putting themselves in these areas of segregation. You have the first ever black student going to a segregated school, and you have to send in the National Guard to be allow that student to be there without there being kind of riots and violence. And the Attorney General's job is to enforce the law in some sense. That's their job in the US. And so Bobby Kennedy was the one who made that happen. Bobby Kennedy was the one who said, okay, the US government is going to side with the civil rights protesters. Essentially, like he had loopholes. There were like little different ways that he navigated this over time. But he was the person who actually mobilized the US state to make the civil rights movement a success. He could have been, the person in his job, he couldn't have, but the person in his job could have crushed the civil rights movement. Right? The laws were set up to allow them to. They had the power to, but he helped it the whole way. And so that's who he was. That's who he was. His brother gets killed as president. He's assassinated. And then, and Bobby Kennedy, just to be clear, he's like his brother, but even more outspoken and even more of a beautiful orator. And he's anti-Vietnam War when the Vietnam War comes, and he has all these positions that are kind of JFK-style positions in some sense. And it's 1968, and he's on the campaign trail for his presidential election. He's pushing to become president. And he's in Indiana, in Indianapolis, and Martin Luther King Jr. Gets killed, gets assassinated. And they're friends. Like he knows Martin Luther King Jr. Like they've worked together on the civil rights movement. And he has a stump speech that he has to give that evening to like this crowd, and it's a mostly black crowd. And this is a separate picture, but it's mostly black crowd. And he goes to some speech, and nobody knows yet. Nobody knows that Martin Luther King has been assassinated because King Jr. has been assassinated because like there's no cell phones, right? Like most people haven't like been able to see their TV yet. He goes to this crowd, and he instead of giving a stump speech, he gives this 5-minute speech where he implores the crowd. He talks about Martin Luther King Jr. He talks about how what a wonder he was. He talks about what a wonder the country is, and he implores everyone to love one another and to hold the highest values that Martin Luther King Jr. held so that could be the vision of the future of the country that was held together by the people in Indianapolis where he was speaking. It is one of the most beautiful speeches I've ever heard in my life. It's 5 minutes long on YouTube. I highly recommend it. And the noise from the crowd when he announces that Martin Luther King Jr. has been shot is horrifying. Over the next few days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, there were riots in over 100 cities in the country. Over 40 people were killed. Tens of thousands of people went to jail. There was this unleash of hatred and anger and violence from this horrific, violent act. But there were no riots in Indianapolis. And I think what democracy can do is that it allows us to elect leaders based on values. It allows us to elect leaders not based off of who's most competent, who's most able to navigate through power maneuvers and smart tactics, the particular structure that they're in, not the person who gets the most metrics, but it allows us to elect people who represent the best of our humanity, the best of our ethics. And, okay. Okay, 1 second. 1 second. And I think, my bad.
For those of you not aware, we're just live streaming this to Waterloo, so we just had to reset the view.
This is the one?
No, I said 2.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. Okay, cool. Yep. Cool, my bad. Okay, cool. So yeah, we have point candidate, and it allows us to elect these people. It allows us to elect people based on values, and it has to be that way, right? We can't actually elect people based off of who's the smartest policymaker, right? Partly because each of us isn't that good a policymaker. I maybe could help with policy or have a decision based on policy in some specific urban issues, but I don't know for 90% of these things. So I can't really adjudicate. But also the list of potential policies they're going to enact is vaster than anybody could actually read through or understand. So we're not going to elect people based off of policy packages. We elect them based off who we think they are. We listen to them, we kind of get a feel for them. We're is this kind of my kind of guy, my kind of girl? And then we put them to power. And so we can elect people based off of values, and we can elect the best of us. And when we do that, we order our societies around those values which we hold to be the most important. And that changes both our ability as a state to function, but also each of us. We look at that model and we try to be more like them. And I think we have forgotten this in recent years in democracy. I think that in our democracies, we do elect people now based off what we think is a policy package, thinking that the policy package is what's going to be important for having them as our leaders. And I just don't think that's going to serve us very well. Because if we can elect people who have the best values, it will pull all of us in that direction. Okay, so that's promoting the worthy. Okay, so almost done. This is the last idea. So this is the last idea, which is Fei Ming. I think it's fourth, yeah, Fei Ming. Against fatalism. In ancient times, kings all wished their state to be rich, with a large population and well-ordered administration. Nevertheless, they fail to get what they desire. What is the reason for this? Many fatalists were gathered among the people, and they said, if fate decrees wealth, then there is wealth. If fate decrees poverty, then there is poverty. If fate decrees many people, then there are many people. If fate decrees order, then there is order. Fate is everywhere. And although one might be strong and unyielding, of what benefit is that? Above, these theories affect kings, causing them to neglect their administration. Below, these theories affect the common people and hinder the conduct of their affairs. Nowadays, why is it that kings go to court early and retire late, hearing lawsuits and bringing order to government, not daring to be remiss? I say it is because they think such diligence ensures good order, while lack of diligence must result in disorder, so they dare not be remiss. Nowadays, why is it that farmers go out early and come back late and are diligent in their sowing of grain and planting of trees? I say it is because they think that diligence ensures wealth, while lack of diligence must result in poverty. And that diligence ensures satiety, while lack of diligence must result in hunger. So, today we have lots of ideas about free will. And there's this idea that the world is basically deterministic. Like there's a bunch of atoms, they're going to flop into each other. Eventually, that's going to like lead to some outcome, and that's basically what happens. And we think about this at some kind of metaphysical level because we think that like there's no such thing as free will and it's all atoms. We think about this at a kind of state level where like, oh no, there's like a natural course to like civilizations, they ebb and flow, and it's just going to happen to this civilization in this way. We think about it at kind of economic levels where like, oh no, like there was an oil shock and so the economy of Canada was harmed or something, right? And what Mòzǐ is saying here is that it just doesn't matter. The only answer that works is to believe that there's no fate. It just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter if that's true. It just doesn't matter. If you want people to actually try their hardest, if you want people to actually try and order the state, if you want people to not act in a way where they lie and are cruel and harm each other, it just doesn't matter if it's determined or not. You are sure as hell not going to actually believe it. The future is open. And this matters a lot to me. When I was in university, I was a terrible student and I smoked way too much weed, like way too much weed. And I ended up getting suspended from school and I had all these like psychological issues. And at the time I believed very heavily in fate. Maybe I wouldn't put it in those terms, but I was very much like, like things are just gonna happen to me and this kind of thing. And it led me into this just complete disorder. And then at some point in that, when I was like suspended from school, I had this like moment of awakening and I believed, actually I can do something about this. Like I can actually the future is open. I can still achieve the things I want to achieve, whatever they are, and I can achieve anything. And things did not get better overnight, but that was the thing that allowed my life to change. I felt at the time like I was on a path to insanity and poverty, and I feel like I've ended up with a relatively stable, sane life. And as best as I can tell, I don't know, I'm trying here. And I think that was the decision. And so it actually just doesn't matter. It's like a Pascal's wager, maybe there's, in Pascal's wagers, like maybe there's God, maybe there isn't God. You just believe because it's the only option that works. And so that's the third idea. Okay, so those are the three ideas. Universal care. If we want to avoid the kind of macro and micro damage that we do to one another so that we can be prosperous, and we want to have the right kind of humility so that we can genuinely understand the world, we have to have a universal care. We have to care for one another, and we have to do that to the greatest possible degree, where we can care for each individual as much as possible and do all the world around us. Promote the worthy. You need to put the absolute best person in the highest possible position. You have to have someone who is the wisest, smartest, most capable, but also the highest values, the best of what humanity could be in the absolute best position, so that we can take that model and that can transform us to be like those people, and so that they can take decisions to make our lives better. And reject fatalism. The future is open. It is not written. We can decide what it looks like. And that's the posture that we're going to adopt if we want to do our absolute best. So those are the three ideas. I hope that one of them, maybe two of them, resonates. And I hope that you're able to use it as part of your posture in your everyday life. I think that these ideas have the ability to transform us as individuals, our organizations, and our society. So I went a little bit over, but I think we have time for some questions. Yeah, any questions? Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that Singapore, the reason why it is the way it is because they pay the public servants a lot more than other countries. That I think at the expense of the private sector. They're just not as dynamic as the U.S. and California, for example. So there's a trade-off there.
Hello. Can you tell me if you hear me through this mic? Just they shoot a message.
I mean, the private sector doesn't seem to be struggling. The top rate tax is 25%. you know, like, I don't think, I basically, sorry, I'm sorry, that was very rude. I guess what I'm saying is, I think, I think that, sorry, that was really rude. I guess I think that it's not, I really don't think that this trade-off between government and private sector is an effective lens to like adjudicate like how these things were effective or not. My sense with it is that what Singapore gets for its money is incredibly effective and efficient government. And incredibly effective and efficient government allows for more dynamic capitalism. It allows for more dynamic economic structures of all kinds. I think Singapore doesn't quite have the same number of billion-dollar startups as the US, but it's only 6 million people, and it does have some. It's like, and its rate, I think, is a little bit lower than the US's. I think it's like, let's call it like, I don't know, but it's a little bit lower. It's not crazy lower, but it's a little bit lower than the US's on a per person basis. But maybe that's just because like all of them moved to the US. The US has so much more money. You can have a billion-dollar startup just by being in the US market. It's not obvious to me that Singapore isn't as dynamic an economy, essentially, is what I would get it. Does that make sense? Apologies, I was a little silly at the beginning. Okay. Yes. Oh, yeah.
I can help.
Oh, thanks. So why do you think that Singapore can get away with like having a massive government and being efficient, whereas like United States now, they elected a guy who is looking to reduce government size, and so how does those two reconcile?
So Singapore doesn't actually have a big government; they just pay them very well. So actually, the people in Singapore doesn't have very high taxes. They don't have like a massive government arm. They do have, I think, relatively big government arm, but they don't have a massive government arm. And it's more so that they get the absolute top performers, and they're very efficient and they're very effective. I actually don't know the precise numbers on like percentage government employees. I probably should to answer this question, but my understanding is that it's not that they have a big government. They just have a quote unquote like a per person expensive one. And actually, Elon Musk has talked about this with Doge that what he wants to do. What? Doge. My bad. I don't know these things. I believe he's talked about this with Doge that he wants to like reduce by 80%, but pay the remaining 20% much higher, which is I think how I read the Singapore model.
Oh, sorry, one last question. Sorry about that. Regarding democracy, like, in order to promote the one who's worthy, like, we need ourselves to be self-aware, like, what kind of people needs to be at the top, which requires, like, a certain level of education. So I'm guessing, does that, like, work in all circumstances, or, like, do you see, like, North America being in that position right now to elect worthy people?
I agree with you, it takes education. I think for a while, the job of the universities was to give you the kind of education to be electing people based off of values and these kinds of things, and they haven't been doing an amazing job of it recently. And then there are other institutions as well, like churches and stuff like that, that had a similar role. I think the future is open. Okay. And so I think I see the US as having like the possibility of electing people with very high values and building the institutions that educate people to elect people with very high values, having strong family values that bring that within the family units. Like I don't see it as like determined one way or the other.
All right.
Thank you. Oh my bad. It's hard to me to precisely. I believe I saw you first. All right, and then I'll go, and then I'm going to go. Oh. Oh yeah. So then I'm going to go.
Simple question. If you had like a really big marketing budget or a lot of like political will or something to make having kids cool again, like in Canada or anywhere, what sort of things would you try?
I think, like an order of maternal glory is like a good place to start. Like, it's gonna have to be like slightly different, but something like that. Yeah. I have a cousin who, he's very pronatal, and he in his like company, he's trying to like get his team to be very pronatal, and I think it's kind of like it's about that, just putting people who are very pronatal and have actually taken the actions to back it up, like in positions of social respect and prestige. You know, like, this isn't appropriate in the modern media environment, but you know, you used to have like, there was like a Canada Minute or like a minute that was on TV that told you like historical facts. What was the name of that? Does anybody remember that? A heritage moment. Yeah. Cool. I wasn't here for that. But like, there used to be these things in Canada called heritage moments where they do like a minute on TV. I could imagine you doing something like that, except it's not about like scientists. It's about like these real life stories of people with big families. But not being ironic about it, right? Because our society is ironic about it. Like, we're very negative about it. We're very negative about having kids, about having big families. We're like, oh, you have 8 kids? Like, how could you possibly manage that? You know, we're like very negative. And so you have to like have a genuine spirit of care and positivity about it, something like that.
Just one quick follow-up. Have you identified any like top structural reasons why people aren't having kids in the West? Like, is there like a list of like top 3 things that's stopping people?
Well, I think that all of the 3 things are like downstream of we don't prioritize kids. So for example, like there's a structural economic reason that our house sizes have shrunk over time, and the new houses that are being built are mostly appropriate for like single people. But that's because the demand is for single people, right? That's why developers are building that. That plus some zoning laws, but you know, like that's kind of a structural reason. There's a structural reason that say more.
Maternal leave and all the infrastructure for childcare. The U.S. is one of the developed countries that doesn't offer maternal leave for mothers after giving birth.
Right.
In Sweden and other countries, they offer like gift baskets for new parents and like a more equitable distribution of paternal leave, maternal leave, right? Because a lot of the emotional labor is put onto women. We saw the pandemic exacerbate those trends. And if you look at the pay gap, women who don't have kids actually have a closer income to their male counterparts than women who do have kids. So that's a huge dent in their career paths. So all of those things can be solved by policies and infrastructures within companies. Like that's why I said just ask your female friends. I'm sure they have answers.
Well, and
What are you talking about, our friends?
well, and the fascinating thing about this is, for instance, that pay gap thing, right? Like the pay gap thing.
It's worse for women who have kids.
So but here's the interesting thing about it, right? Like, it's worse for women who have kids, and in some sense, unless you have massive redistribution of wealth, it will be, right? Because there's so much work that goes into having kids that you can't put into your career, and so it strikes me that the right answer to that is to be like, who cares about the money? Like, kids are way more valuable than the money, like, you know, and to reorganize our society to recognize that and to then move resources around in relationship to it. Does that make sense? I think that's yeah.
Not to get too far, but the American government cares more about like defining a fetus and the life of a fetus than the actual women who are like voting in their societies, right? So just their basic human rights for like standard of living for women. But I actually wanted to comment about some of the questions in Singapore, because I've actually collaborated with folks at the National Institute of Education as well as folks at the Ministry of Ed in Ontario. And so being a Canadian and working in both contexts, it was really interesting for me to see how the government workers and the educators in Singapore were much more dedicated, and they were much more forward-looking and innovative in terms of willingness to take risks with their practices, try new ideas, work with universities, commit more to private-public partnerships to generate these innovations, whereas there was much more red tape to get around in Ontario, even though I was more familiar with the system. So I think that it was, at least for me being in those spaces, there was a huge cultural difference and just kind of the spirit of moving forward and innovating. And also with the urban planning, like Singapore is developing the vertical farming and addressing all these issues and climate change that we're taking a while to catch up in the West.
I think
he has a question.
I'm gonna come back to David, I promise.
Do you view countries like Canada as a sort of stagnating Chinese dynasty? And do you feel like we need a collapse of that dynasty to reinstitute the progress that we had? Thank you.
I do think that Canada is in a very unique cultural moment where we had a Laurentian elite. So we had there's this idea of the Laurentian elite, and it's the people around Ottawa who are these kind of third, fourth, fifth generation Canadians. Trudeau family is a perfect example of them. And they ran all of our kind of major institutions and set the direction for the country. And they have a very particular set of culture and norms and views of how the world works. And we've mostly just elected Laurentian elites for most of the Canadian history. The current Conservative Party is slightly different to that because it was kind of the result of this kind of like rebel movement from Alberta that came in and kind of took over the Conservative Party and gave it this like fresh blood that's not quite Laurentian elite, but it's still like old Canada to some degree. Like, it's different, but it's old Canada to some degree. It does feel like, for better or for worse, the Laurentian elite just doesn't represent Canada at all. Like the people in this room, like I got here 7 years ago. I don't know what they're about. Like I don't know what they're about. Like like you can look around this room and like Toronto, which is the population and economic center of the whole country, just doesn't look like the Laurentian elite. Neither does Vancouver. Alberta's its own rebel thing. The Atlantic provinces are getting hollowed out at a very fast rate. And so there's a way in which like the set of cultural values that we have just doesn't seem. Yes, there's something that like people, as you're here, you imbibe the Laurentian elite values, but like there is a way that we need some kind of new dynasty. I don't know if that means like a collapse of like the democratic order or something, but there does feel like there's some kind of new set of cultural values. Maybe it's part of this Alberta rebel thing. Maybe it's some kind of, I feel like there's a culture that's emergent in Toronto that hasn't yet become clear. There is some culture that is the Toronto culture that 80% of us just got here in the first or second generation immigrants, that we've brought with us something that is our new culture, and it's not expressed yet in this clear way, but I think that's important. Sorry, I love that question.
Just one follow-up, sorry. So would you agree that besides the death and destruction, that war is a positive, given that it resets institutions?
No. I'm very like Burkean and like anti-revolution, anti-war. Like I just don't. In another life could have been a Quaker pacifist. Like I'm like I don't know. It doesn't. I get it. Like I get that war can be like destructive and therefore produce new areas for fertile things to grow. I kind of get the guns, German steel idea that like when you're fighting, it like forces you to refine your ideas. Like I get that the warring states was very productive because you're shopping these ideas to all these different states. I'm just not convinced that it's necessary. And if it's not necessary, we shouldn't do it because it's not good when it happens. The downsides are real.
Thanks.
I think, do you have some from Waterloo?
Waterloo's all good.
Oh, no, okay, then, what? I'm sorry?
Waterloo's all good.
Oh, all good? Okay, then, Dylan, I saw your hand, and then, okay, we'll go back there. Sorry, it's hard for me to keep track of them.
Thank you. First off, I just want to say, Ben, this was a great talk. I don't know if you saw me in the corner here, but I was like a bobblehead, like most of the time. I really appreciated the synthesis of the ideas that you presented. Could you go to the last concluding slide with the 3 points? Yeah, so I'm sort of curious here, and you hinted on this a little bit too, and I'm sure we can have a long conversation about this idea, but one of the things I think that like synthesizes all of this is you were talking about like a change in values. We've had values, they've sort of shifted, and so the spirit of people has changed drastically. And I think you're calling here for a revitalization or a reinvention or a usurping of the spirit that we have currently with maybe new one, with maybe old values, maybe new ones, but either way you're saying it isn't working. Something that sort of underlines your conversation about these things also was sort of this like atomization of individuals, right? Like also a lack of responsibility. And I think that anybody who has conversations nowadays, there seems to be this fluid thread of everybody saying like, oh, I'm just one person. I'm just a drop in the sea, I'm not going to change my behaviors because, all these corporations do all this polluting. And if I stop eating animals, then, that doesn't really make a dent. And you sort of see this all the time, which is so fascinating because like the obvious thing is like, well, if people actually like a tide of individuals did something, there would obviously be a change. And so this is sort of this limitation in our thinking. And I can't help but like connect it to what you're saying here. So I guess my question is, how do we reinvent agency in our lives and view ourselves as like actual agents, capable of making decisions that have impact? Maybe a big question, but I'm curious what you think.
I don't know how good an answer I can give. There's a guy on Twitter called Casey Climbs with a K. He's based in New York. He's working on a conference on agency, bringing together all the people who are thinking about it, because I think there's a lot of people thinking about it. There's a lot of people who are really focused on this being an essential question, is how do you build more agency? How do you just do stuff? How do you become the kind of person that interacts with the world as if it were malleable, when it does feel like the culture is against that? And so I'd look up Casey, I'd bug him that he actually has to do this conference. He said he would on Twitter. He's tied to it now. So I'd recommend that. In terms of answering the question, I'm not sure. I mean, I certainly think these are helpful. Like, I think these are helpful ideas in that regard, that maybe I can't quite do it for universal care, but for promoting the worthy, I think putting people who display higher agency on a pedestal, glorifying them, recognizing them as being the people in our society that we love, which we are currently doing with Elon Musk, for example, and I know some other people in that is important for doing this. Rejecting fatalism, saying that it doesn't matter, it's not closed, the future is open, we can figure out what it's going to look like, is, I think, very important. How to do it en masse, very hard. I don't know. I'm not sure.
I'll put an idea out. I'm curious what you think. I think, like, in part, our institutions, government, even the socialization of our children, it kind of feels like we like permanently fasten water wings to everybody, and like we want everybody to be like permanently comfortable and protected and not to face any sort of adversity, and to eliminate this on every rung of life, and to like instill comfort. I think we live in a culture that really glorifies comfort
rather than glorifying suffering. Yes.
Yeah, well, which makes sense. I hope we do that, but like,
we used to glorify suffering.
Right.
We used to glorify suffering.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with that. Great point. Yeah. I think
One more question back here and then one from Waterloo.
Okay. Yeah. So this guy.
It's very similar to the question he raised, but slightly, it's a bit more adjacent. So in the part, I think it was on promoting the word, you did mention that I guess part of the problems that we have is we think almost very binary towards when we elect policymakers, we want to elect the best people that make, that are going to make the best policy decisions. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but part of how I think about it is like there's an element of like a part of us wants to elect people that lead with the brain versus a part of us has to shut down the people that kind of lead with the heart for like the morality of what is the right thing to do as human beings. But I feel like to an extent there's a bit of a trite, perspective if you just say like, oh, hiring the people with the best morality is what's going to solve it, because they might be really shit policymakers. And in this changing world where it feels like this, the separation is becoming wider, where it's very hard to have people that have both. What do you think, how do you think it can be, I guess, fixed? How can we start bringing it slightly closer where it becomes more commonplace, where when you're electing people with morality, it's because you already know that there is an element of like that capacity to actually make good decisions for policy?
I don't know that they are necessarily becoming more distinct. I think certainly that's our framing of it in the people we're electing now and how we think about it. Right. I don't know that they necessarily more distinct. I think two things that came up as you were saying that. The first is wisdom actually used to be part of morality. Right? And wisdom isn't quite the same as being technocratically smart, but it is actually like the skill of taking good decisions when faced with good decisions, even if you're not like a physics gigabrain or something. And so I do actually think wisdom is part of the moral package that we're looking for. And then there's another aspect to it that at some level, if you're winning in a presidential race or like at the top of a party, we know that you've got some smarts. You know, the political maneuvering, the a number of debates that you have to win, these kind of things. The raw horsepower you're running on has got to be pretty high at that point. And then the third thing is the most important decisions for technocratic policymaking are not the leaders, it's the departments that they hire. Like they're the people who write the policy and run the show on the ground for mostly. And so, so I'd say, yes, I think you're right, you do need both, but I think there's a kind of wisdom that is a part of the moral package.
Right. So it's not fully mutually exclusive.
Yeah. I think one for Waterloo, and then I promise David.
One question from Waterloo. Sages from Waterloo is asking, do you think that high salary is what's driving government jobs to be high status in Singapore, or does it have more to do with the cultural makeup and ideas around a more cooperative versus individualistic society?
I think it's kind of both. I think that the salary is a reflection of the fact that culturally this is deemed very important, and the fact that people are comfortable with this high salary is kind of a reflection of that. But then also, because it's a high salary, this person then becomes more of a cultural icon, and you know, because money talks in some sense. And so I think it's a bit of both. I remain deeply skeptical of communitarian versus individualistic society descriptions for East Asian versus Western societies. I kind of get it, but I also just remain skeptical that it's a very powerful approach, and the reason is because you know, you look at the way that societies in Europe operated in the 1700s, and they were very communitarian, right? Like communitarian was just the way that societies operated. And then you have this kind of modern thing, which is very individualistic, right? Like modernity is very individualistic, but it's not obvious to me that it's, you know, China today has not also just fully adopted super individualistic norms, or that Singapore hasn't just adopted modern super individualistic norms. And so I think if there is a communitarian individualistic divide in how you relate to these things, it's not necessarily at the level of like deep roots cultural aspects so much as like how this particular society has interacted with modern norms. Does that make sense?
I hope it does, Decision. Okay. But yeah, I think that's it for tonight.
Cool. I promise, Dave.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, I just found it really funny that like Mòzǐ, he kind of described 996 because he was like, the kings and the farmers, they should go to work early, they should come home late. Like he just invented 996 a few thousand years ago. I have a real question. So essentially in our timeline, our history, Confucianism ultimately won out against most ideas. They kind of won like the battle of ideas, and ultimately Confucianism found the most product market fit with feudal China, which, and arguably China today, you know, up until like very recently, is still neo-Confucian and feudalist, right? And then in our history, in our kind of world, you know, like China invented a bunch of stuff, including these great ideas, gunpowder and all this amazing stuff, but ultimately the West is responsible for the vast majority of progress in that chart. So I guess my question is that if in an alternate universe, maybe sometime in like the Ming Dynasty, there was a kind of reformation, you know, there's kind of reformation or kind of neo-Moist ideas similar to the Protestant Reformation. Do you think that China could have industrialized and kind of been responsible for much of the progress, or do you think there's still something missing?
That's a great question. It's a real
question.
I certainly think there's something about Mòzǐ that is, I read it and it just strikes me as deeply modern. It strikes me as like very closely tied to what we think of as like the, you know, Enlightenment Western values package, and then like how that developed in philosophically. One of the interesting arguments I've heard for why the scientific revolution happened in the West and not in China was that in the West you got this society that was very Christian, and they took this idea. You can see it like explicitly in Galileo, and you can see it explicitly in Kepler and like all of the early scientists. They took this idea that God had laid down laws, like moral laws about the world that held universally, and they applied that to the idea that God had laid down natural laws that applied universally, and there was this kind of universal law that the world was governed off of, and this allowed for the scientific revolution, and that allowed for the kind of insane technological takeoff in Europe compared to China, because before that China had been much more technologically productive. And I think that's an interesting idea. I don't know if I believe that 100%, but I think it's a really interesting idea. And if that's the case, then no, Mòzǐ wouldn't have led to a kind of scientific and industrial revolution, because universal law in that way wasn't really part of the approach. Like, this was much more like practical, piecemeal, incremental, what works right now, what's the postures. There isn't really, like, even heaven in this is kind of a, let's figure out what heaven wants, not like heaven universally wants these things. So if that's true, then this wouldn't have produced a scientific revolution. I certainly think that this is like Mòzí's pretty good. Like, I would double down. I would like double down on Mòzí in like any system.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good answer.
Okay. Any other burning questions? Jeff?
Where can you get, like, is there a book that describes all these ideas?
Yes, there is. It's this book.
Okay.
It's academic philosophy, just to be clear, but like really good, like really good. Like, I recommend it. Like, everyone should read academic philosophy. Like, that was not a knock on academic philosophy. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Okay, cool. I think so now we can hang out and mingle, and please get more snacks and enjoy. And thank you for being here. Wait, I lied. I had one thing I wanted to say. Thank you for raising your hand and reminding me.
He has one more thing
I'm using
to
this
say.
as a pitch. Okay, this was an experiment for me. I've given 4 lectures now. I gave one on tacit knowledge, and then I gave this lecture series on ideas about progress. And you know, it was cool for me to lecture, and that's great. But I wanted to say that I'm running a lecture series, not me speaking, in January next year. And we're going to have 5 lecturers, all way better than me. Like, these people are absolute professionals.
Debatable.
We've got Eric Lombardi. He is the top housing advocate in the city. We've got Matthew Jordan. Did anybody hear about the Taylor Swift course at Harvard? He lectured at that, and he's amazing. He's really good. Michelle Jia. Yeah, Hidden River Tours. Anybody know this? Yes. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Sick. So Matthew Jordan's going to be lecturing on the founding myth of Toronto. Yeah. He's very smart. He's a very smart guy. Michelle Jia, who is going to talk about everyday anthropology. She's a lecturer at Stanford under Michael Barry, who is kind of like the father of design thinking. Anson Yu, who is
Anson Yu.
this just. I do not fully understand what her lecture's on. But it's like every time I've seen Anson speak, it is electric. So I'm really excited for that. And then Daniel Goliher, who's a friend of mine in New York, who runs a civic school teaching about how the government in New York is structured to give people agency. And his talks on agency in politics, like, how do you become a person who can actually affect the politics of your city? And in 5 years, he's gone from being someone who thought of that as an idea to someone who's actually shaping the political future of
Every
New
Wednesday
York.
of
And so
January.
he's a fascinating person to listen to. Anyway, this is going to be running in January of next year. It's on the U of T campus. And if you enjoyed this talk, I think this is going to be way better, and I highly recommend everybody sign up. The individual tickets for each lecture are going to be going live over the next 4 or 5 days. Supporter tickets, where you can buy a ticket for all of the lectures in the series, are live now. So that was it. That was my final piece. That was it.
Free tickets. Come to Toronto.
Cool.
Okay. That is the end of the lecture. Thank you, Waterloo, for tuning in. I'll say
Thanks,
bye.
man. Thank you. I'm
Farewell.
glad you enjoyed it.
Enjoy the night.
Like, what do you
Thank you guys for everything.
like? Any feedback?
Good luck with finals. Ben says thank you. He's off camera, but he's saying thank you, and he's waving.
Second one I missed it, and I should have
Okay, love. Good night, good night, good night, good night.
I love the interactivity in this one. It's like, and especially your enthusiasm, like the examples, is very like fantastic.
I won't lie. I told a few people this, that like I did this whole series because I wanted to give this lecture.
Yeah,
So.
it generally felt.